Arratzaldea, ongustoi, mila esker ekitaldi honetara etorri izanagateak. I guess I have said in a literal translation, thousands of thanks for being here. Good afternoon to everyone. We are going to start the third panel with the title, The Challenge of a Plurality of Demos. Thanks for the governance and LC and the European Institute for inviting me. For me, it's a pleasure to be here with these academic giants, and I will explain why I believe that they are an academic giants.
Because you're very tall.
That way, in an academic point of view. No, yes, actually, I was thinking how to moderate this panel, and I have to think in the Greek mythology, and when you start searching the Google Scholar, then you can read the Newton idea about the standing in the shoulders of giants. And for me, as a PhD student, it's a pleasure to be here and moderate this great debate. Miguel Maduro is on a leave as a minister of the government of Portugal. He is professor and director of the Global Governance Program. Thank you. He is professor and director of the Global Governance Program at the European University Institute and visiting professor at Yale Law School. He was Advocate General at the European Court of Justice from 2003 to 2009. He has been a Fulbright visiting research scholar of law at Harvard University, doctor in law from the European University Institute at Florence. He has worked as a lecturer at numerous institutions, including College of Europe, Catholic University of Lisbon, the University of Lisbon, London School of Economics, Chicago Law School, Center for the Political and Constitutional Studies in Spain, Instituto Ortega Gasset at Madrid, and as well at the Institute of European Studies of Macau. His published works include We the Court, the European Court of Justice, and the European Economic Constitution, the Past and Future of EU Law, and the Plural Constitution, Constitutionalism, and the European Union. In general, he has published articles in several languages on issues of EU law, constitutional law, human rights law, and international economic law. Correspondingly, I don't know what happened. Correspondingly, he has taught courses of EU constitutional and economic law, international trade law, and comparative institutional analysis. And on my research, I found very interesting that you have published a non-legal book called Crónicas de un peixe fora do água. That literal translation is a pez out of the water. Please, with the talk, with the title of Towards a New European Deal, you have 20 minutes. I will give you we're in 5 minutes left.
Thank you. I hope I'll stick to the 20 minutes so that we can have as long and engaged discussion as possible. So, I've been before going to government. I worked for a long period of time on what can legitimate the process of European integration, and including how best to address the challenges that the European Union has been facing in this time of crisis. And increasingly, since perhaps because of my insight in government recently, having returned to academic life, I decided I wanted more and more to look at that also in relationship to what can be the triggers that can make the ideas that we defend for the European Union viable. I've always felt stuck when we discuss the process of European integration, how to evolve in democratic and legitimacy terms the European integration process, into a kind of pattern whereby we have a solution for the problems the Union faces. We have a series of proposals, but the feasibility of those proposals depends on a political reality that will only exist once those proposals will be in place. I think this is one of the greatest difficulties that we have when we think the process of European integration and its political and social challenges. that a lot of what we assume is necessary depends on a reality that will only occur once what we believe is necessary will be in place. And so we are in a kind of vicious cycle. The political dynamics necessary to achieve the changes that we believe are necessary depend on the changes in the first place. So this is really a matter that has increasingly concerned to me. And I think if we look at the history of European integration, when you had the changes that we believe were necessary, it often happened in a kind of serendipity effect. It's not like if you can say, well, there is this strategy that you can follow whereby, or these political paths that you can follow, whereby your ideas or your proposals will be debated, deliberated, and somehow accepted or declined. Whether certain political changes that each one of us may argue for the Union come out to be realized or not in the European Union is often the result of a series of variables, of elements, that if we try to look at them in a scientific manner, we can't really determine what they are. We often can't. There's a deal, it's often a deal, but the variables that determine what will be possible, feasible or not are extremely difficult to identify. And that's why I believe it's necessary to work increasingly. Not only, it's a little bit like with all the cautions of the parallel, that is a false parallel. It's a little bit like the Palestinian conflict. There are like 10 peace plans out there, but no one knows how to go from the status quo to any of those peace plans. So everybody discusses what the solution will be, but no one really is able to come up with the elements, with the triggers, with the aspects that will make it possible, any of those solutions, or the discussion on any solution whatsoever. And so I want more and more to focus in my work on the triggers. What can be the triggers that will make possible the changes that I believe necessary or that either of you believes necessary? So in my talk today, I want to focus on providing a narrative, explaining both the challenges of the Union, the European Union, and in that light, trying to come up with a narrative for the European Union. And that's a follow-up to a lot of things that I have talked about in the past. But then also try to identify what can be the triggers. What can be the essential trigger? As you will see, the trigger itself is, in my view, extremely difficult to implement. So again, we go back into this vicious cycle. But if I had to identify one or two elements that I believe could be crucial in setting in motion the dynamics that could lead to the transformation that may be necessary in the European Union, it will be those two that I will try to address. So the title of this panel is about the plurality of demos. And to a certain extent, the Union has been much more successful in legally addressing this plurality than in democratically addressing or politically addressing this plurality. It's interesting that in the context of law, we developed constitutional pluralisms, courts have developed a series of mechanisms, of instruments that have somehow allowed to arbitrate, regulate, accommodate the competing claims of the different national legal orders and together the European Union legal order. Interestingly, we haven't been as successful with respect to the way the European Union, and particularly in the European space, we arbitrate, accommodate, manage the claims of the different national democracies. So there's a much stronger deficit on the way we deal with plurality at the political level than at the legal level. And if there is a fundamental reason for the problems that the Union has faced, and in my view the difficulties that the Union has had in facing the successive challenges, the successive crises, from the euro now to the refugees crisis, is the extent to which the powers and the interdependence that exist at the European level have, on the other side, a very high level of political, economic fragmentation. So it is the gap between the degree of interdependence at the European level and the level of political and economic fragmentation on the other side that, in my view, explains both the crisis, a lot, or at least several of the crises that the European Union has been facing, but also the difficulties of the Union in addressing it. And I want to focus on what is this problem of political fragmentation, and how is then this problem, how does this problem manifest itself at different levels. The first one is an asymmetry between the level of policy making that we have on many issues at European level and the level of political action, and where political will is formed that is still national. So many of the issues are already decided at the European Union level, need to be decided at the European level. I would say that there are other issues that are still not decided that ought to be decided at the European level. Perhaps there are also some that are currently decided at the European level that could be nationalized again, but there are certainly elements or additional areas that should be the object of European decisions, of Europeanization if you want. But in any event, one of the crucial problems that we have is this asymmetry between decision-making being or ought to be at the European level on the one hand, and on the other hand, politics being national. And this is a problem because the national political spaces haven't internalized the consequences of interdependence. And because they haven't internalized the consequences of interdependence, they then provide the wrong political incentives for action at European level. It's because the Greek public opinion didn't internalize the consequences of interdependence that provides wrong incentives for its leaders at European level. It's the same thing with Germans. Mrs. Merkel answers to the German people, to German public opinion, and that public opinion, the German citizens, haven't fully internalized the consequences of interdependence. So the way political will is formed creates this asymmetry. This point also has a second consequence, that is the very high costs of decision making. And these very high costs of decision making in turn make the Union very ineffective in a variety of domains. One of the things that is for me remarkable is the extent, for example, when we hear everybody talking about the refugee crisis. Everybody is always saying the European Union is completely ineffective. The European Union doesn't do. Europe needs to do more. Europe doesn't answer enough. But Europe doesn't do enough. Europe is not effective because of the difficulty to arbitrate and to align the different political wills of the different governments that respond before different national democracies. It's a consequence of this, as simple as that. But somehow there's this gap that is created, as if Europe could act on its own and doesn't depend on the need to coordinate, to bring forms of cooperation, or to arbitrate then the different national democracies. The problem is this, that this ineffectiveness, it will not be problematic in democratic terms if it will be accepted as a cost that we as citizens take for granted, because on one side it means that in relative terms each of our national democracies has a particularly strong saying at the European level. But it's not. This gap, this asymmetry, if you want, even almost this problem of intelligibility in understanding how the Union works, means that this ineffectiveness in fact becomes a democratic problem. A problem of accountability, but then a problem of the idea of self-government, because it seems that we can't decide on certain issues, that we cannot govern on certain issues at the European level. And the idea of democracy is an idea of self-government, and if you can't govern, then it's a democratic deficit. I think one of the aspects of the democratic deficit of Europe, where everybody talks about the problem of ineffectiveness, has a problem of challenge to the traditional form of legitimation of the European Union, focusing on results, on output legitimacy. In fact, the problem of ineffectiveness of the European Union, for me, is increasingly a problem that affects the democratic understanding and foundations of the European Union itself. Because, as I said, without the capacity to govern, there's the idea of self-government itself that is at the core of democracy is put into question. Third, this difficulty with decision-making at European level often leads to transfer certain issues from politics into technocratic domains. We have the same phenomenon at national level, but increasingly we have that, I would say we have that even more at the European level. So the way politics has learned to deal with the incapacity to politically and under the traditional decision-making mechanisms deal with certain issues is by taking them away from the political processes into technocratic independent bodies. Now, this in itself becomes problematic because I accept that a certain degree of transfer of certain issues, or if you want, a certain degree of disciplining political processes through technocratic bodies or independent processes is necessary. But once it passes a certain degree, then it puts into question the understanding of democracy itself. And moreover, there is no development, no satisfying elements of how you can somehow link the growing powers of technocratic and independent bodies to democracy. You may need them, and you will certainly need that in certain issues to be insulated from day-to-day politics, but you need somehow to reconstruct then the link between those processes, those bodies, and democratic authority. And we haven't been able to develop those mechanisms. And with the growth in this process, again, a democratic challenge emerges. Moreover, this also contributes to a mismatch between national and European politics and dialogues. First, these asymmetries between the European and the national level of democracies means that there is a frequent process of transfer of political costs with both at the national level. Sometimes certain issues are presented as being a responsibility of the European Union when in fact they can be responsibility of national political actors. Other times national political actors pretend that certain issues could be decided on a purely national basis when in fact they are subject to negotiation with the European level, for example. At the European institutions themselves too, sometimes de facto exercise authority through national governments or national parliaments, but exclude themselves too increasingly from the political responsibility of those actions. And so we have an increased problem of accountability. But this problem is not simply a problem of accountability at European level. The problem is on national democracies. Most of these problems that I'm mentioning are not problems with the European democracy itself, are problems with national democracies and the way national democracies either compose the European political process or the way national democracies deal with European interdependence. So one way to address these challenges will be to defend the view that we need to limit integration and interdependence. All the issues that I mentioned are not a consequence of the process of of they're not a consequence of the European Union, are a consequence of interdependence. The product of interdependence between member states. Now, the European Union contributes to that interdependence, but in other instances is also an answer to that interdependence. But one possible way of dealing with the consequences of this would be to say, well, let's limit integration and interdependence. And some people, in fact, argue that this is a solution. The problem that we've gone too far, we have too much integration, we have too much interdependence, we need to withdraw to our national democracies, we need to give competences back to the states. This manifests itself in a variety of ways. I find this very doubtful, because on one hand, even if it was possible, so let's assume that it was possible, and I think in a lot of issues it's no longer possible. One thing is whether there's a variety of issues where the answer to the same question is different, whether you're discussing whether to do something, or, for example, the euro is a case in point, or whether you're discussing let's undo that. We might have a different answer if we were now in the process of saying, should we do the euro or not? But that is a substantial different question of saying, should we undo the euro or not? But let's assume that it's possible to reduce interdependence and limit integration. I think that that will also lower the quality of our democracy. Why? Because autonomy is social by definition. Autonomy is built in our relationship with the others. I always give the example. Let's imagine that someone will drop you in the middle of the desert where no one can impose physically anything on you, and you are there in the middle of the desert on your own. Does it make sense for you to say, well, no one can impose anything on me, I'm finally free to be and do whatever I want? It doesn't make sense, because our individual realization, but also our collective fulfillment, is done in relationship with the others. So I think that the crucial thing is not to reduce interdependence. There are a very large number of gains that we have from interdependence and from integration. The crucial thing is to understand the consequences of that interdependence, including the consequences in terms of democracy and the consequences in terms of social justice. And for this, I wanted to go back to use the work of an Italian archaeologist that's called At the Origins of Democracy, someone called Buccellati, the archaeologist that studies the Mesopotamia period. And he identified the origin of politics with the emergence of urban development. When people no longer related between themselves on the basis simply of family or tribal relationships, but as individuals, because they had a language on one hand, and because through those urban aggregations they started to share resources, a river, for example, a territory. It was as a consequence of the need to decide how they were going to share that resource, manage that common resource, or how they were going to regulate the conflicts emerging from sharing the same territory in a context where they did not belong to a family or they did not belong to a tribe, that politics emerged as a way of regulating that. And the lessons to derive from here is that, contrary to the usual understanding, or at least the usual the ideas most often endorsed in the discussions on European integration, political integration is not a result of identity, but is a result of interdependence in a context of diversity. So if we follow this example of Mesopotamia, this example of the work of Buccellati as an archaeologist, one will have to reach the conclusion that politics results emerged not where you had identity, but where you had diversity in a context of interdependence. And to a certain extent, what we are faced now at European level is with the same challenge. The challenge of having, if you want again, to rediscover politics by being in a context of interdependence with diversity. So in this respect, I diverge from some of the interventions in the morning that were focusing on what can be the common elements that provide the legitimacy for political integration, for democratic government. I think that's the wrong way of looking at the problem. The problem is that once you are interdependent, the more diverse you are, the more you need a legitimate democratic way of addressing that interdependence. And the crucial question that we have is whether we want to be interdependent or not. If we want to continue to be interdependent on a variety of issues, then the question of democracy is a consequence. Sure, if we find elements of commonality, they are empirically very useful to support the instruments of democratic governance. But these instruments of democratic governance are a necessity coming from interdependence, not from identity. Now, this said, in my view, the narrative precisely that we should develop for Europe, the narrative that the European integration needs to develop as an alternative narrative to the traditional narratives of peace and prosperity that has become, to a large extent, dated, or the narrative of output legitimacy. The alternative narrative, it's a narrative of presenting the European Union as the new space for democratic governance and for the implementation of the social contract, where states can no longer fulfill that role by consequence of interdependence. And in the past, I've given many examples, and particularly in three areas, both mutual externalities between states, or in areas involving transnational powers that individual states can no longer control, such as financial markets, taxes as a consequence of mobility between companies, for example. There's a variety of areas where states can no longer provide an effective and adequate forum of political organization to support essential elements of a social contract and democratic government. And it is those areas that the European Union should intervene, and it is by its role in providing democratic governance and providing the instruments for a social contract in those domains that can justify the role of the European Union. So democracy in the European Union is not a consequence or a requirement of the powers that the Union has. Democracy is the goal that the European Union should pursue in areas where the nation state can no longer provide those democratic mechanisms. And that's how we should construct it. So to conclude, what can be the triggers for this? Because you might agree with what I say, you might not agree with what I say, but then again, we might be faced with the reality with which all of our ideas have been faced. And we might say, okay, we are academics, we are here to put issues on the agenda, and certainly we are, and it's very important that we place in the agenda. We are not here to think about in terms of political viability, but I think actually in the role of academics, we constantly think about that too. How can we make this viable? I think that it's by focusing on one or two triggers. And I think the two elements that are crucial in order to develop this narrative and the role for the European Union in terms of democratization, where states can no longer provide that democratic legitimacy, and social justice, where states can no longer secure in certain areas elements of social justice. I think the two crucial elements, one is developing a European political space, and the other one is own resources, stronger fiscal capacity on the part of the European Union. But how do you make them happen? Well, I want to make here two proposals. The first one is with regard to the emergence, and I'm really trying to conclude. We have already tried to politicize the European Union by virtue in the most recent European Parliament elections. We had different candidates for President of the European Commission put forward by the different European political groups. And the idea is, well, we now have these different people will be electing a President of the Commission, with the consequence that the debate for the European elections will be more Europeanized, will be a choice between these candidates and their respective political programs supported by the different European political parties. Now, it hasn't fully worked this way. To a large extent, it has not worked this way. But that was, in part, a consequence of the fact that many did not believe that that was going to be the case. Many said, oh, it doesn't matter that you have these candidates. When the Council will have to decide, no one of them will be the President of the European Council. I remember many people saying this. It's impossible, will never work, blah, 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 blah. It's a good, by the way, it's a good tale to remember when you hear many people in Europe, including politicians, discussing ideas. Oh, yes, that's very interesting, but it will never work. I heard this for years on the question of the choice of the President of the European Commission as resulting from European Parliament elections. People telling me, you're dreaming, never. The British, until the last moment, no, the British will never allow that it happen. This means that what I believe will happen too is that when you will have the next European Parliament elections, then people will know that it works this way. So the next time you have the European Parliament elections, people, including media, and through media also then the citizens, will be much more aware that in fact there are different candidates for President of the European Commission. The aspect where I believe we need to work is the element of transnational politics linked to these candidates. If there was something that was disappointing for me, was that there was really no one paid attention to what was. If I will ask you what were the differences between the political programs of alternatives of Juncker and Schulz, no one knows exactly what they were. So here comes my proposal. I think we should have primaries within the European political parties for candidates to President of the European Commission. That next time we should have genuine primaries with votes. Why? Because I believe it will be the discussion between the different national parties that will then ignite a discussion on European issues at the national level and with a transnational dimension. So one thing that I believe will be important is to, as the next step, will be to have primaries within the different European political groups that will allow to articulate European political ideas of a transnational nature and to discuss them through the national political parties at the national level. The second aspect is that I believe that the lever that is the most fundamental lever for the changes that we need in Europe is own resources. I'm a real believer that if I had to put all my money, all my energy, all my political capital, that's not much, and all my academic capital, then maybe it's no longer that much either, it will be on own resources. For one simple reason. What makes difficult, impossible, a discussion on all policy discussions on European level. Because you can only have a variety of policy discussions that you need. The refugee crisis. Most people will agree that the only effective way of addressing the refugee crisis is by harmonizing aspects of I'm really sorry. Aspects of migration policy of the refugee status at national level. But that requires financial conditions. You can only do that if the European Union can then provide funds too. And the problem is that the dependence without that fiscal capacity, the Union really will not overcome the problems that it has. But it will never have that fiscal capacity without moving into own resources. Because until the discussion is dependent on transfers from national budgets, any discussion on what the Union needs to do is immediately dominated by a discussion on some of the Union paying for others of the Union. And second, it gets blocked in the European political process. If you detach European resources from national budgets, that will be the most powerful lever to then be able to discuss and adequately address a variety of other elements at the European Union. The problem is that this lever is itself extremely difficult to implement. But if I had to select one in which to invest, it will be on that one. Thank you.
Thanks, Miguel, for...
Apologies for the...
No, it's okay. I think it's several ingredients to start a big discussion, what you call in your abstract a conundrum. And now is the moment, the turn for the Director of Governance, Daniel Inenarati. He's Professor of Political and Social Philosophy and Iker Basque Researcher at the University of the Basque Country. His work mainly focuses on the cultural and political transformation of technological societies, on innovation of our system of government, on democracy and globalization. He's also visiting professor at various European and American universities, currently appointed visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His latest books include The Transformation of Politics, The Invisible Society, The New Public Space, The Democracy of Knowledge, and all of them translated into several languages. As well, he belongs to the Academy of Latinity and the European Academy of Arts and Sciences, based in Salzburg. And now, Daniel, you have 20 minutes, please.
The idea of providing a narrative for the European Union suggests that we are going to explain what is inevitably complex in an arbitrarily simple manner. If that were the case, what we would get in terms of popularization would be lost in accuracy. We would have gained nothing if what has been understood and accepted was something substantially different from what we have to narrate. This is the quid, in my opinion, of our problem, and the sooner we recognize it, the less exposed we will be against populist or technocratic simplifications. The question we have to ask ourselves is a double one. What contribution shall the political theory make in order to understand the European Union? And what challenge does a polity as novel as the European Union poses to set political theory? So far, we have solved this problem either by trying to expand the basic concepts of democracy, taking as demos, popular representation, or control, or accountability, to cover the European sphere, or by using the trick of considering that we were looking at a sui generis reality, and thus basic categories of democracy could remain intact, admitting in this case a harmless exception. But the problem still awaits for us in its full seriousness. How can we think and build a democratic reality dissociating from its territorial basis and from the reality of a sovereign state? Solving this problem implies not only institutional innovation, but also and above all the need to reconsider our concept of democracy, or stating it the other way around, we will only be capable of achieving institutional innovation if we rethink our concept of democracy and the categories associated with it. The idea I proposed, the idea of a complex democracy, can be used for both things: to renew the concept of democracy, the main categories of which were coined in times of great simplicity, and to rethink our democraticness standards without forcing the nature of a polity as complex as the current European Union. We should not surrender to the difficulty of the issue, theoretical as well as practical, and assume that the European Union has crossed some complexity limits beyond which the idea of democracy itself would stop making sense. One of the greatest simplifications has been thinking democracy, and also democracy of the European Union, on the basis of the national state model. A good part of the semantics of the democratic deficit has, as a background, the idea of a statehood deficit, or a failed state even, when what should be thought of is a non-state-based institutional reality, in which other actors, logic and legitimacy, are put at stake. If Tocqueville claimed that he had done without the old models to understand democracy in America, what should we do without to configure democracy in Europe? We should probably start by abandoning the prejudice of thinking that there is an incompatibility between complexity and democracy. Couldn't it rather be that when increasing the complexity, that is my hypothesis, when increasing the complexity, societies tend to be more democratic? Or, in other words, that it is less likely that they are governed in any other way that it's not democratically. Thus, we could talk about the advantages of complexity for democracy and the advantages of democracy for complex realities. The former because the multiplication of actors, interests and instances of governance balance the exercise of power and complicates unilateral imposition, while the latter is due to the fact that democracy allows to articulate that plurality better than any other government system. Democracy is not at odds with complexity. It is, on the contrary, the government system that better manages it due to its internal dynamism and its capacity of self-transformation. In the face of the unacceptable conclusion of Carl Schmitt that democracy is only possible under the condition of an, I quote, exclusion or destruction of the heterogeneous, we can confirm that many national systems of government successfully operate under conditions of profound heterogeneity. We should not exclude beforehand the possibility of adapting democratic institutions to contexts that, from the very beginning, do not make it any easier. Frank Michelman has talked about some inhospitable conditions for democracy in the complex society we live in. And indeed, the technical complexity of many of our decisions, the institutional density, the difficulty to delimit the problems or the effects of decisions, these are properties that contrast with those categories through which we usually grant the certificate of democratic quality and which have a certain tone of simplicity, immediacy, and inclusion. If useful fictions of democracy were categories which allowed conferring a political format to societies that had to be democratized today in more complex societies, its ill-considered application can fatally depoliticize them. As Kelsen warned, the idea of a general interest and an organic solidarity that transcends the interests of a group, a class, or a nationality is ultimately an anti-political illusion. The construction of the general will today cannot be but a commitment between different actors, institutional levels, plurality of values, political cultures, etc. Democracy solely exists when individuals obey laws of which, with all the institutional mediation that is present in a complex society, they are authors. It is possible to insist in such authorship in a complex political systems that are not about the way already is experienced of the representative democracy in the scale of national state. This is the main challenge that post-national political constellations, such as the EU or the global governance processes, currently pose to the political thinking, where there is an attempt to preserve complexity and manage it, not eliminate it. When it comes to the European Union, the transition from technocratic simplicity to technopopulist complexity poses specific problems related to both government and legitimacy. For a long time, the more apolitical it seemed, the more successful economic integration has been immunized before the political disagreements and with a reduced number of actors. Evidently, we are no longer there. It is the increasing complexity what leads me to share the skepticism of Christian Jorges in relation to modern societies and the EU in particular being able to change in just one big bang. Many of the democratization proposals are infra-complex insofar as they imply that there may be a pure inaugural moment or a strategy that entrusts the task to a single procedure. Rather than a democratic deficit, Europe may have a democratic dilemma. Talking about deficit is to trivialize a little the complexity of the matter and cause expectations that could be satisfied when the criteria governing the democracies of the states were applied in the EU. Having rather a democratic dilemma means that we are before something that cannot indeed be resolved, and that is only possible to rebalance. There are two different democratization vectors, that of the member states and that of the transnational challenges, none of which can completely subsume the other. And this compound character of the Union must be respected in any democratic commitment reached. That's why the first complexity of the Union derives from the fact that there are three intervening logics: that of the states, the intergovernmental one, and the transnational one. And it would be absurd to expect a solution to our problems by eliminating one of these sins or by its complete subordination. Europe's agenda should say a definitive goodbye to the semantics of harmonization and the unity to move towards fair management of complex constellations. And it should do so in a historical moment where the need to understand democracy as a shared power is imperative. With subnational governments and with supranational institutions, with a variety of public and private organizations, with NGOs and international agencies. In fact, in recent European studies there are research lines pointing in this direction and which deserve more attention and which have in common the fact of being descriptive and critical at the same time, to the extent that they have introduced something very similar to the complexity in their approach. Those ways to place the concept of complexity in the reflection of European democracy are, among others, worth in quote. The idea of democracy to refer to a Europe acting in a united manner without constituting a unity, the concept of compound polity, as Sergio Fabrini uses to say, that intends to balance the principle of equality between people with that of equality between states, the observation that there are elements of government and elements of governance in the EU, that is an intermixture of formal decision-making and informal relations between administrations, social actors, and epistemic communities. The appeals to strengthen the element of diversity of actors and perspective in our decision-making, and all those ideas trying to make pluralism more visible, as the idea of the multiple unions or the transnational democracy. These are perspectives that go one step further from that rhetoric of the multi-level democracy that became the trend by the end of the last century, and that still expected to organize that plurality in a hierarchical manner and in a single model, something that, in my opinion, does not do justice to the real complexity we have to manage. The narrative of Europe as a complex democracy seems to be sentenced to failure when what we expect is that people understand it. Europe runs the risk of becoming a victim of complexity in times when mass politics turns into populism and simple messages. Now, is it better that such narrative is understandable if what is understood has little to do with what had to be explained? And besides, complexity is not the same as complication. Complexity has less to do with the explanation of all the resourcefulness taking part in the institutional life of the European Union than with the ability to facilitate the understanding of the fact that we are playing a less intuitive game in which we must comprehend the logic foreign to the national mentality, but not especially abstruse, of interdependencies, of shared sovereignties, of the common risks and opportunities of the binding interests. It is true that people have great difficulties to acknowledge a democratic structure in Europe, when self-determination seems to succumb before complex negotiation systems and constrictions of all types barely justified, which enthrone the principle of the technically possible compared to what seems politically desirable for the immediate evidence. Based on this difficulty, the debate confronts those considering that democracy has to be reinvented beyond the boundaries of the nation-state, and those considering that modifying our traditional idea of democracy to a larger space will do. Between those who do not seem to be too uncomfortable with a post-parliamentary democracy and those who see a possibility to release democracy from its all-national format. And maybe our debates make us lose sight of the fact that the political practices of the Union, examined from the complexity perspective, are both more democratically valuable than federalists recognize and more perfectible than sovereignists can live with. The dispute regarding the nature of democracy is always on the background of the debates about the EU. But it is convenient not to forget that we must understand the nature of the EU in order to be able to answer the question of its democraticness. This does not only mean that we should understand the real institutional modus operandi and surrender to the so many times mediocre game, but that we should understand the logic and the objectives for which that institutional level is supposed to be, as well as the global context in which it has to act. If the EU were susceptible of a conventional democratization, then we would not have needed to create it. We already had the national states to meet the requirements of democracy. A deficit at the level of the national states had to occur in order for the idea and the need to invent another governance level to arise. The necessary integration, which is something more than a simple aggregation of politics in Europe, to the extent it implies a certain renunciation to a specific type of national prerogatives, it will only be economically successful and democratically acceptable if citizens understand that such renunciation is compensated with new configuration abilities. European integration will only be valuable when it represents an improvement in the provision of certain public goods that the states are no longer in position to guarantee, and when people understand that. That being said, that democracy will not have exactly the shape we know, rather it will imply a transformation of democracy. Anybody could object if this is not the old trick of calling democracy to whatever exists now and renounce to any normative hope. In order to dismantle this critique, the complex democracy that the EU represents will have to be able to prove itself as the best way to organize complex societies in which the difficulty of adopting decisions is best resolved, and the new context according to the classic political criteria of legitimacy and justice. I go to the end. We should not forget either that the configuration of Europe is taking place in times in which we have also to think about the constitutional structure of the global system. The EU may be in the forefront of the battle to configure democratic spaces beyond the national state and may reduce the incongruence produced between global interdependence and the political instruments we have at our disposal. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. Perfect timing. And from now we have about 15 minutes, and I would like to give the opportunity to the public. I guess a first lap, if you prefer, a first lap of questions, and then with the time. Please, Professor.
Yes, thanks for your two very enlightening contribution. I have questions for both. I start with Daniel. I like very much your idea of rethinking standards for democraticness beyond the national level, and saying, of course, if we talk of deficit, we cannot use the same standard at the national level, and applying it to the transnational. But 2 points. Complexity is different from complication. Fine, that's analytically true, but I wonder whether complexity in the long run doesn't really result in complication, namely opacity. Opacity meaning a lack of accountability. You don't know what the results of your political action are. Think the last time you voted and the difference between what you desired when you voted and what you have before your eyes now. And whose fault is it? Whose responsibility is it? Who is responsible for the difference between the outcome you wanted when you voted and the outcome you have your eyes? That's opacity. That's complication. And I wonder whether there isn't some necessary link somehow empirically between the two. The other question there is a recipe that has been developed domestically by Michaelman and Ackerman and Rawls, which is called democratic dualism, under conditions, domestic conditions of extreme complexity, translating into complication possibly. The result, the remedy is dualism. So saying that the standard of legitimacy is geared to consent at the constitutional level only. The consent of the governed makes sense as a standard only at the level of higher law. The rest of the legal, judicial, executive kind of output is deemed legitimate only if it is not unconstitutional. All right. Now, why couldn't that be applied to the supranational level as well? That's the question on my mind. Why couldn't it work? So if you have EU governance being legitimate, outputs being legitimate, if they conform to some kind of constitutional standard, some kind of which are then blessed by consensus. So in that sense, the Weiler's recipe, forget the Constitution, undermines the chance to talk about legitimacy. Let me ask a question also to Miguel Maduro. I like very much the proposal about primaries. I find that very creative, and also the other one about own resources of the EU detached from national resources, but I wonder, this is a question for clarification, how do you get them from national quotas? Then we're back again to the same problem. How much does my country contribute relative to other countries contribute? Or are you thinking that the EU could levy taxes directly from EU citizens independently of the nation state? The second, okay. Then the one thing that I was most puzzled by in your paper was your claim that politics emerges not from identity but from interdependence. Okay. Now there's no more interdependence than the one the EU has from oil and from Gazprom. And yet we don't want to have a federation with Gazprom. That's interdependence. No, that's interdependence. It's interdependent. You need something that is located elsewhere, and you have to enter some deal, some division of labor, some exchange with some other place. Plus, interdependency is global. So if political union rested on the need to remedy interdependence, that would be an argument for global governance. How can it be an argument for EU governance? When EU countries and EU as a whole are obviously in an interdependent relation with many other places. So that brings back the issue of identity.
Okay. If you allow me, Daniel, I would like to collect more questions at the end. To that, please. Okay.
Okay. So I will try to be brief because I think the protagonist should be with the speakers. I have a question for Miguel and perhaps a very small question for Daniel. And Miguel and myself, we agree in a number of points, but here I would like to push you a little bit in further clarification on the use of diversity. I think I will agree with your normative standpoint that diversity requires a more democratic process of management of our diversity. But then when we jump into the triggers, you spoke about the process of politicization and the selection of commissioners. Now, you criticize first the idea of consensus and saying that you are taking a critical standpoint. But my question here is, to what extent you are not really presupposing some degree of consensus when you select your trigger? Because you are focusing on those who agree on the relative worth of the European Union, but you were perhaps serious about diversity in the European Union, the underlying cleavage there that would be the leading element for politicization will be between Eurosceptics in a very radical way and also in a very wide way, Euro-positists, so to say, not to say Europhiles or Euro enthusiasts. So in a way, you depart from diversity, you question consensus, but then you need to assume some kind of consensus to politicize diversity. So there's a kind of contradiction between the normative construction and the pragmatic requirement you have to satisfy. And I wonder how you can bridge that. And it would be a very good response because I need that for my own construction. So thank you very much. And for Daniel, a much more pragmatic question, which is when you were talking about the provision of public goods as the factor that justifies European Union, European integration, I had a very specific question. What, in your view, is the mechanism to identify in a setting of diversity the goods that should be provided at the European Union level? Are you speaking of some kind of democratic process? Because normally the democratic process starts afterwards, right? And we have a given setting by the treaties that have evolved through time, but not necessarily product of a democratic process in the way you are describing. So I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more how this provision of public goods, or how these public goods can be identified before the democratic process of how to provide them starts. So it's a different question, which goods are to be provided, to how they are going to be provided. I could agree with you on the second part of the question, but not about the first. I have difficulties to see the origin of that. Thank you very much.
I try to be even brief. Yes, okay. Okay. Now, Miguel, it is one success, really. I was surprised how Juncker really has another authority than he used to have. And nevertheless, the battle was, I am for growth and stability, I am for stability and growth. This was about the contest. And this is not there. Now, the problem is really with this huge thing that the contrasting of these programs is a huge problem. But I have another concern with your first example, political spaces. I have studied a few things thoroughly. One was comitology. And what was comitology good about? It was creating a political space for specialists in food safety, and they came together, they deliberated, and they came up with something. Why did it work? And why did comitology turn into a purely bureaucratic, technocratic exercise in the meantime? It did work in a relatively homogeneous union with not so many participants and with not such a huge workload as they have it now. So I'm not accusing that this is changing, I'm just saying the difficulty, and this is something where I would ask you whether you have some idea how to protect these political spaces against the transformation into something which you did not want to create. And the same is, of course, true when you ask who is going to distribute the resources. But I stop here and I'd rather ask Daniel. Daniel, you owe us one example where you would say, this is how I imagine. Take, for instance, monetary union with this strange separation of fiscal, economic, and monetary policy, and no mechanism to resolve these conflicts in a political, responsible way, but just by compromises and later by technocratic governance. Okay, I stop here.
Right, we have a last question. Comment or question?
No, I had two questions for Miguel, but my first one was actually made by Alessandro. But let me just say that I sympathize entirely with your.
Which one was it? So I know.
Yeah, let me say what I was going to say. So I basically use the same arguments. So I'm sympathize with your argumentation because I basically use the same arguments to justify global democracy. So it's not evident why this should stop. Maybe you don't think that this should stop at the European level. So I would like to know whether you think that we could basically use the same arguments about interdependence and so on to move a step forward. But the second question I have for you is whether you think that so I completely agree with this idea of sharing resources and making this visible, right? But wouldn't it be also useful actually to use the resources in something that is also symbolically important, that goes beyond distribution of power among states? Like, I don't know, to make the question very concrete, what do you think about this proposal that Philippe Van Parijs has made about creating some kind of basic income, European basic income, right? To fund which, I mean, so the idea, Van Parijs' idea is that the EU should give this basic income to every single individual in the Union, and should, in order to fund this, it should have some kind of TBA taxation, right? So that would be a proposal that would use your proposal of having some kind of independent resources, but it would also use these resources to create something that people could visualize as characteristically European, right? So I wonder what you think about these kind of proposals. And then, so my question to Daniel, so it's a genuine question. I would like to know, when you say complexity and diversity, are you thinking only in the diversity that is generated by the existence of different states and different nation states, or you would go beyond that diversity? Because some of the people who have thought this idea of democracy, right, that you mentioned, I mean, some interpretations of democracy basically understand democracy as, we will create a union of different demoi, understanding by demoi national demoi, right? That's one interpretation. But there's another interpretation, for instance, the one that Samantha Besson and others have given, right, which understands democracy as a way of deterritorializing democracy, right, and articulating complexity in a way that is not necessarily referred to national diversity, but it can come actually, so the divide between the diverse units can respond to very different criteria, right? So, and then it's not that you have an attempt to articulate some kind of organization between diverse national peoples, but you go beyond that point actually, and you try to articulate other kind of diversity that might be also important for democracy.
Okay, just a remark. We are running out of time. Our resources are about 5 minutes, if organization allowed us, or between 5 minutes and 10, if okay. Please.
5 minutes each or a total?
Our resources.
Yeah.
You manage.
So maybe the order in which I will answer will be slightly different from the other questions were posed to actually allow me to be shorter. So the one first question was why stop at European level, and why not as other instances of interdependence? So I think that there is a normative question and feasibility question. At the normative level, I don't exclude at all the possibility and actually the need that you will have of forms of democratic governance beyond the European level. What I believe is that the Union provides the empirical conditions already in many instances that allow those forms of democratic government. But there's also another element. One first step is the recognition that you are interdependent. In the question of the oil, Russians will say this is our resources. You depend on us, come and buy it from us. It's not a matter of having decided to have in common that resource. Instead, at European level, we already recognize in a variety of domains that we are interdependent. Of course, we might decide that we do not want that, but as I said, we should have that discussion, and then we should have it like that in terms of saying what will be the costs, the opportunity costs that we'll have of not being interdependent, for example, in the area of asylum and migration and all that. But once we recognize that we want to be interdependent, then it's much easier. And so I think the European Union just provides a much better forum for that. Second, and this then links to the question of how to achieve, the Carlos question, the trigger question. So, I mean, the problem that you pose is exactly the same one with which I started my talk. And it is a fundamental problem that we have. It is a circular thing. In order to achieve what we want and believe it's necessary in the European Union, the conditions that make that possible depend on what we want to create ourselves. And so it's very difficult. But then I only see one way. That is to identify one or two targets. Put your energy on one element. And what I believe is the advantage of own resources is that it is among the many proposals that we have, and this is one impossible proposal among dozens of impossible proposals. Among all those impossible proposals, this is the one, if you want, that has one of those, perhaps the one, that has a stronger radiating effect in making other proposals than possible. So what I see the difference with own resources is that while you might be able to achieve something else or not, that will stay there. The own resources then has an impact on a variety of the examples he was proposing of, then the income and all that. That will only be possible if you have own resources. Something that, for example, Portugal, the Portuguese government suggested was a kind of an employment fund. Goes in that direction too. Will only be possible if you have own resources. Because if you have it on the basis of national transfer of national budgets, it never happens. It's extremely difficult. And what I believe it works with own resources is that if national politicians will understand that once they take that step, once they detach the funding of the European Union from national budget contributions, that will make their life much more easier for future years. Because they won't have, every year is increasingly becoming more difficult to discuss the budget, because every year the question that emerges is, oh, we don't want to give more, we want to contribute less from our national budget. So at a certain point I believe they may realize and think, okay, even within the short term of politics, that is 2-3 years, it may make sense for us to go on own resources. What can they be? In my view, they have to be linked to, but this I propose already in a report to the European Parliament, including TVA because of that. They have to be linked to either to economic activity that is made possible by European integration, so that the citizens realize the link. Why should this be a resource of the Union? Well, because it's actually made possible by the Union. It could be areas that involve externalities between states, cross-border pollution, for example. I remember I had a case at the European Court of Justice, very interesting one. I would tax atomic energy, for example, because I had a case at the European Court of Justice involving nuclear power plant on the border between Austria and the Czech Republic. And as a curiosity, I asked one of my law clerks, arrange me a map of the nuclear power plants, where are they in Europe? 80% of them are in the border, next to rivers, with the rivers flowing to your neighboring state. So the externalities potential is clear. Areas such as that, I think, and the advantage is that it's not only the way this will fund the Union, is that this will actually help educating the citizens too about the reason why you have the Union. Precisely to correct this thing. One other element, and I'll conclude with that one, is the fact that in some areas you could argue to citizens that the European Union is the only way through which you can reinstate a balance between the contributions of all citizens to, for example, the welfare state. Let me give you an example. As a former politician, when in government, I defended two things that might seem contradictory. I defended that Portugal should lower its corporate tax, and that the European Union should have a corporate tax that doesn't have. And that's, in my view, I will defend that this is the rational thing to do. Because from the point of view of Portugal, if you want to be competitive in tax terms, you have to lower your corporate tax if you want to attract investments, because you have competition for corporations. But if you look at the contribution of society as a whole in aggregated terms in Europe, what you see is that companies' contribution to the taxation, in terms of taxation, has lowered 50% and not that of individuals. Why? Because companies can benefit much more from mobility of the internal market than individuals. It's a consequence of interdependence and mobility associated with it. Who can reinstate the balance between this different set of taxpayers? Only the European Union can do it. And I think, for example, people say it's impossible to argue a tax, but if you say to citizens, no. If you, for example, if the member states will be in agreement, most member states at the same time will lower the individual tax to citizens at the same time that you adopt one at the European level for corporations, this will probably make the Union much more popular.
Thanks, Bill. Now, Daniel?
I would like to say I have the answers. What I do not have is time enough, but it would be not true. What I can do now is modify a little my answers in order to give a more or less coherent answer to the many questions made by you. First of all, complexity is not only that complexity stemming from the diversity of national states that are in the game. Neither the complexity of the multi-level management at European level, which both suggest that we are, or as if we were in a frame, in a hierarchical frame. That is not the complexity we are dealing with. It's a diversity not only of actors, it's a diversity of spaces, it's a diversity of times, it's a complexity coming from the extremely technical difficulty of the decisions we have to make. There are other questions from Alessandro. What I can say in general is almost all our democratic categories, sovereignty, self-determination, accountability, representations, come from a time of a relatively simple societies. In our time, I am convinced that improving democracy means complicate democracy, make democracy more complex, introducing more elements in terms of time, in terms of actors, in terms of spaces, in terms also of technical issues. For instance, aggregation is not simple. Aggregation of interests of actors is a complication of things, but not a right complexity. Addition, we are experiencing this all the time in Europe. Addition without the added value of vision or formation of political will results often on the long run in situations that are absolutely irrational. This is complication, but not complexity. No? Or the opposite of transparency is not opacity in the positive sense. The opposite is mediation. We can no longer live in societies with a certain level of mediation, which is in a certain opposition to an ideal of transparency without representation, without the elaboration of political will. There are no agreements or no commitments or no consensus without a certain level of opacity, or I prefer to say mediation. Many people have criticized the fact that the process of European integration has led to problems of democratic legitimacy within the nation states. But in my opinion, little has been made of the reality that integration, that is my perspective, integration was responding to specific problems of democratic legitimacy that already existed within the member states. The member states on their own were and are unable to guarantee certain common goods that the citizens have the right to expect. An image to illustrate it. When Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greeceland, made his trip especially to Berlin, and gave his press conference with Schäuble, the finance minister of Germany, both spoke in these terms. Varoufakis said, "I have commitments with my electorate. I cannot accept this or this one." And Schäuble said, "Me too." That is a simple mechanism of opposition between interests without the added value of cooperation. That means that we have only a level of democratic responsibility and legitimacy on the national states, but absolutely inefficient regarding the problems we are dealing with. And there are other levels, for instance, the European Central Bank, with the capacity, like the magical words of Draghi, to solve a certain problem, but with a deficit of legitimacy. This gap is our dilemma, our problem.
All right. I guess this is the end of this panel. We would like to invite you to have a coffee and still discussing a new narrative for a new youth. Thanks to everyone, and we will be here in about 15 minutes to be 20. Thanks.